Bernie Sanders, speak at UVM, and he was speaking to issues as directly as he does today. And that really inspired me to take interest in what could happen in political office, who could get into political office, because I had been pretty cynical about the realities of money in politics and that issues weren't really getting dealt with that I thought should be, including climate issues and environmental issues. And so then I ran in 94, and I did lose in 94 as a student at UVM. And it was that fall after I graduated in 96 that I was lucky enough running a second time to get into office. So Paul wanted me to talk a little bit about what is the state doing and what policies have been implemented over the years around the climate crisis. And through my years in the legislature, there's a range of topics from energy policy to agricultural policy, transportation policy, housing policy have all got ramifications for our climate and our environment. And it was actually as an environmental studies minor that I was, before becoming a major, that I learned the impact of agriculture on our environment. Obviously right there in the picture, I'm driving a diesel tractor, but really the movement of the soil, the tillage of the soil, releases a tremendous amount of carbon and organic matter that volatilizes up into the atmosphere. And at the same time, we have the opportunity, we're not yet doing it the way we should, but we had the opportunity to have agriculture policy that pays farmers for their, quote, ecosystem services. And that's something that's being talked about in Montpelier and even across the country some now, which is if we grow more cover crops and we do less soil tillage, we can actually pull carbon out of the air because, of course, plants breathe carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And if they can pull down that carbon, and we can take that plant matter and turn it into the soil, we can actually use agriculture as one of our primary tools to reduce carbon in the atmosphere and take on climate crisis. But we aren't there yet. What we have done in state government, along with other states, is looked at fuel efficiency. There have been some advancements there. We've put in a few electric recharge stations. We've tended to try to give incentives to people to, with grants or low interest rate loans, to weatherize their homes, to purchase electric vehicles, to put solar panels on their homes. And all of these steps have been steps in the right direction, but some of them have actually gone backwards in the last few years. Some of the incentives on solar panels have been reduced. The argument was made that solar panels are becoming less expensive to buy, so we don't need to give as many incentives for people to put up solar panels. But on top of that, we've actually put some hurdles in place with respect to putting up solar panels on your property, giving neighbors more say and the town more say in where panels can go. And that's actually impeded some of the growth. So in the last couple of years, we've actually lost 500 jobs in the solar installation industry in Vermont alone. And that's been really unfortunate, in my opinion, because I think that installing solar power, distributed solar power on homes and businesses and rooftops all over the state is really one of the ways to build ourselves more resilience for both climate challenges that are coming our way, as well as, frankly, even something like this pandemic, that if it were to disrupt the electric supply, if more people had solar panels, the ability to have power packs in their facilities, even their cars could be the batteries that store energy for their solar energy, folks would be more resilient. So we have some policies in place. We had goals to weatherize 60,000 homes by 2020. We've weatherized, unfortunately, only about 25,000 homes. A couple of years ago, there was a bill passed to raise the fuel tax by a couple cents in the House. And that was going to raise about $4 million to weatherize an additional, couple hundred homes a year. I felt like that was a very small step, and in some ways, even taxing the wrong thing. Sometimes it's important to look at what is the impact of the tax that you're trying to achieve, and will it achieve it? And what is the use of the money, and how can that be used, and how does it satisfy your goals? It turns out that increasing fuel taxes by 2 cents doesn't change anyone's habits. So if the goal is to increase a tax to make people do something different, as we've done, for instance, with tobacco. We've raised it quite a bit to make it much harder to buy tobacco. If you change fuel prices by 2 or 3 cents, it doesn't change anybody's habits. They've got to get to work. They're going to continue to do so. They're going to buy the same vehicles. When fuel was up by a couple dollars a gallon, that certainly changed the purchasing habits of a lot of Americans. But a few cents isn't going to do that. So if we're trying to raise money, one of the questions is, do you do it in a regressive way that hits working people who are already struggling to pay their bills, or do you do it in a more progressive way? In any case, the legislature did find money without raising taxes to allocate towards energy efficiency, or I should say weatherization of homes. And that was a shift of money from Efficiency Vermont and the energy utility taxes that were primarily for electricity improvements in people's homes, buying better light bulbs, changing out fixtures, and moving it towards the weatherization program. Again, that was going to weatherize about 200 or 300 more homes a year in a goal of reaching 60,000 when we've only had 25,000 homes weatherized. So this brings me to, where do we go from here and how do we get there? There's been a lot of conversation about a transportation climate initiative, which was a regional compact of New England and Northeast states down to Maryland and Pennsylvania, to have a region-wide plan to raise the wholesale price of fuel and use that money to both compensate people of working class situations so that they wouldn't get overly hit, but also to invest in weatherization or other climate mitigation strategies. As a region, that would potentially work well, but there's a lot of discussion and question because the pushback on, again, a carbon tax is quite robust from the half of the Vermont population that is living paycheck to paycheck. And that reality for folks is becoming particularly clear today with the COVID-19 pandemic and all those folks being asked not to go to work, and for the last month having no income. And I can tell you as Lieutenant Governor, we are getting calls left, right, and center that the unemployment system is failing and people are having a hard time putting food on their table. So as people contemplate a future with a better climate situation, one of the things I learned, I'm going to connect the dots here for a second, but one of the things that I learned watching Bernie Sanders was, for all the social justice issues we want to fight for and work towards, if people are economically struggling, that's going to be their first and foremost priority, putting food on the table, putting a roof over their head right here, right now. So if we want to address the climate crisis, even issues like the Transportation Climate Initiative or weatherization bills, if working class people are made more, their lives are made much more difficult and they're right on the edge financially, they're not going to support policies, even though they want to. Many of them want to see a better climate for their future, for their kids, but they're in the here and now. And I think as a policymaker, I can reflect that as we look towards the future, we have to look towards policies that don't regressively tax working class people in order to try to make the changes we want. We also have to maybe try to incent and help working class people implement programs that would be better for them and better for the environment. So when we look at weatherizing all these homes, right now, many of the incentives pay people back over time, but you need a lot of money up front. To put up solar panels, you need a lot of money up front. To change out your heating system, you need a lot of money up front. So even though you will save money by moving to a more efficient system that uses less energy, if you don't have the money up front, you can't do it. So a lot of the past policies of tax credits or grants, that rebates that you pay, that pay individuals back after they buy an electric vehicle, for instance, working class people just can't afford to do that. So I think going forward, we need to look at policies that both get money from those who can pay, which tends to be the higher end of the economic spectrum, and are used to incent people of working and modest means in ways that they can actually take advantage of. So maybe it's covering the upfront cost with a loan and having a very, very low interest rate of return by which the savings in the household is more money than the payment needs to be to pay off the loan over 5 or 7 or 12 years. We need to look at really changing our transportation system, which is just as much related to buses and park and rides as it is to broadband. Because, for instance, if we had far fewer people commuting to work, Vermont is one of the highest per capita mileage per capita in the country. And that's because our houses are spread out all over the state. We're one of the most diversely spread out geographically states in the country. You look at many other states, they got hardcore urban areas and the suburbs around them, and then they have a lot more open space. Vermont has a lot of open space, but all in between are these beautiful roads with houses at 3 acres, 12 acres, 25 acres. And so people are driving long distances to work. If we had better broadband in our state, we would be tackling both the climate crisis and some of the economic inequity that occurs around the state, which we're seeing again revealed by this pandemic, where the schools are closed, people have to learn remotely, and yet in about a third of the state, many people couldn't even watch this program right here because their bandwidth is not wide enough to absorb it. So as we look at policies down the line, we have to think about investing in ways that both tackle the climate crisis and work on tackling some of the economic and social inequity in our society. And that's something that a lot more people are talking about today than were 5 and 10 and 15 years ago. We also have to talk about affordable housing. One of the issues for a lot of people is in order to afford housing, they have to live farther away from where the economy is strong. So housing in Chittenden County, for instance, is a lot more expensive than housing that's 60 and 80 miles away. But if you're working a minimum wage job, you can't afford to live in Burlington in many situations. And so you've got to live far away, which means driving farther. So if you're a barista or you work at the coffee shop, you can't do that remotely. So we have to build more affordable housing in our cities and in our village centers and really invest in that opportunity for people to get started. I think that's true in particular for a lot of younger people. So we have a lot of students on the show today on this program, and you know that when you get out, you're not going to be making, many won't be making high-paying jobs right out the door, and therefore housing and housing expenses are going to be quite difficult. Even in Burlington with some of the rental properties, you need 3 or 4 or 5 students living in a place that at 600, 700, 800, maybe even more a piece. That is extraordinarily difficult for a young family to then consider renting that same place with maybe 2 bedrooms for $1,500, $1,800 a month working on minimum wage. So building affordable housing is part of an environmental future. Putting in broadband is part of an environmental future. Investing in programs that help seniors weatherize their homes and working class people weatherize their homes. We have very old housing stock in Vermont. That is part of a climate future. And all of those things also create jobs. So the opportunity for a Green New Deal where we invest in the infrastructure of Vermont's economy while making it in a greener climate ecological way, I think is a real possibility in Vermont. I want to just touch a little bit more on agriculture and some of the issues around sustainability in agriculture and how that can really be a shift for resiliency, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an environmental storm event or whatnot. In Vermont right now, we have a lot of people that grow their own gardens. We have a lot of milk. We produce about 1.2% of the nation's milk. But we only drink about 5% of that milk between drinking it and eating cheese and other milk products. But on the other foods, vegetables, grains, and meats, we produce very, very little. My farm, along with being lieutenant governor, I'm also an organic farmer, as you can see in the picture on the tractor. We're about the top 5% in scale of farms. There's certainly some farms bigger, Mazza's in Colchester, Paul Harlow's farm down in Westminster West and so forth. But at 15 acres of vegetables and 1,200 meat birds and 30 or 40 hogs each year, we're a larger farm in Vermont. But frankly, we feed about 200 families in Chittenden County in the summertime, maybe a few more because we sell at the farmer's market. We also, in November, have quite a bit of food stored in storage, probably about 100,000 pounds of food to go into the winter to sell all winter long. But the reality is, even in Chittenden County alone, with 150,000 people, that's literally 2/3 of a pound of food for everybody in Chittenden County for one day. And so we don't produce in our state nearly enough food to really meet the needs of Vermonters. And so therefore, the average food mile is true for Vermont like it is anywhere else in the country, which is between 12 and 1,500 miles. So if we want to think about the climate and farming, not only should we be shifting towards systems that sequester carbon, as I talked about earlier, but we really should be boosting the local agricultural system so that we aren't shipping food nearly as far as we do currently around the world, and so that it actually helps boost our rural economy, which again will help local stores survive, which means people won't have to drive as far to go to stores. So what I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of interlinking aspects of society and policy that all can lead us in a better direction or not as good a direction when it comes to policy for the state. I think at this point, Paul, I'm going to double check whether there was much more to get into. I guess I'll speak briefly, as I did introductory, how I got into politics and getting inspired by Bernie. But it was really that amazing experience being a student at UVM and having then Congressman Bernie Sanders come and speak. And I not only was inspired by him, but all the people in Burlington that I met through his campaign that I then volunteered on, who were involved in this range of issues, that some were passionate about housing, some were passionate about criminal justice reform, some were passionate about the environment. But what we did was each person organized or worked in the arena they were passionate for, but they also stood in solidarity with the others to build that support for Bernie and for progressive ideas that have been moving in Vermont over these last 20 years. And I really learned that as an individual, you have a voice, but as you combine your voice with others, it really does start to grow in terms of the power in the political process. And in Vermont, we're very fortunate because each legislator represents a relatively small district. For each legislator, there's about 4,900 or 5,000 people. And that means your legislators are accessible to you. If you want, wherever you live in this state, you can find who your legislator is by going to the Vermont Legislative website. You can look that up on Google, but it's leg.state.vt.us. And you can type in your town and learn who your legislator or legislators are, both in the House and the Senate. And those folks are accessible to you. It's not maybe like what we picture as Washington or statewide office holders, but even those of us in Vermont who are statewide office holders fancy ourselves as pretty accessible. And you can certainly reach out to me through my website at the Lieutenant Governor's office in Vermont, and through my one office person, my chief of staff, Deb Wolf, which is deb.wolf@vermont.gov. And again, you can find that online. So we are all very accessible. And as people organize and raise your voices with ideas and solutions on the issues, you can actually help make things happen in Vermont. And I learned that back when I was at UVM many moons ago, and it's been kind of a ride ever since. I certainly never, ever imagined that I would be lieutenant governor or even running for governor as I am. But the reality is if you fight for issues and you stay honest to those issues, and also when I say fight for, I should really say advocate, because anytime we get in people's face, I think we don't make as much progress as we could otherwise. And so what I want to wrap with before Q&A is to say that just like your own family or your friends, if you're trying to get them to think about your position on an issue or move, you don't typically take your finger and start poking it in their eye going, you better do this, you better do that. Typically, those conversations don't go very well. But what I find is if you call your legislator and you say, what are you doing about the climate crisis? What are you doing about sustainable agriculture? What are you doing about renewable energy? If you ask questions of your legislators, they will be required, if they don't know the answer, to go ask another legislator or ask one of the lobbyists who are working on the issue for more information. Whenever those conversations happen in the halls of the State House, that starts to move the conversation. Because if 6 or 8 different legislators approach the legislators on the energy committees and are asking them, hey, I have a constituent that asked what we're doing about the climate crisis or renewable energy, those legislators have heard from their colleagues and they start to think, wow, we better do something because all of our colleagues are getting calls from their constituents, and each call represents a vote in very small numbers. I will tell you, I lost my first race by 59 votes. So every vote really matters. Bernie won the mayor's office the first time by 10 votes. So when you call and ask questions, your legislators want to at least get you answers, even if they're not the answers you want to hear. And what I also think is interesting that people sometimes don't realize is legislators have 0 individual personal staff, which means that their source of information is constituents, and another source are the lobbyists who are in the building. And the word lobbyist is not as terrible as we often paint it. There are all types of different lobbyists. There are lobbyists for petroleum companies and pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. There are also lobbyists for environmental groups and women's reproductive rights groups and social justice groups. So the term lobbyist is a broad term, and ultimately those lobbyists' job is basically to advocate for issues that their clients want and to be resources for legislators. Well, the other people that can be the resources for legislators are you. If you have a passion for something or you have an experience in something, then you actually have more knowledge probably on that topic than the legislator does. Just as I know a lot about organic agriculture, I really don't know as much about being a teacher. I don't know as much about some other, being a stonemason. And so one of the things that's important to recognize is that each of you in your life and in your experience probably has more knowledge about both what you do and what you're passionate about than most legislators. And so make yourself available. Be that resource librarian. Develop a relationship with your legislator by asking questions and having reasonable conversations. And that is how, over time, you will actually shift policy and shift the conversation. So with that, Paul and May-Kay, I don't know if you've got any questions lined up, but I'm happy to hear them. And I'm going to take a half second to let an animal out the door, but I'll be back in 3 seconds.
Okay, so thanks so much, Dave. I'm going to take over for just a quick moment here and remind everyone that they should submit their questions to the Q&A, and then we will collate them, and May-Kate will be doing the asking, so I'm going to switch over to her next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dave, for giving us some background. And for those who don't know me, my name is May-Kate. I'm one of the TAs of Hazards here. So, Dave, we've got some good questions lined up for you. And a lot of people were wondering about weatherization, since that came up in your intro. So our first question for you is just, what is weatherization and what does that look like here in Vermont?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm sorry to use terms that without enough definition, so I appreciate the clarifying question. So weatherization means there are all kinds of great tools that we now have to look at a house and think about what the envelope is like. What are the walls? What are the windows and doors like? How well do they keep the insulation of, heat in and or cold in, depending on what time of the year? How about the seams around the doors and how good are the windows? How old are the windows? And so weatherization programs are programs that help fund up front either re-insulating a home, replacing the windows or the doors, putting insulation in the roof or the attic of a property. Sometimes it can even be including things like shifting out the heat source and systems in the house, which isn't so much weatherizing, but it still is creating a more efficient household. So the term weatherization is used for the process of making a home or a building of any kind, it could be a business or an industrial center as well, more efficient so that the energy that goes in doesn't go out. It can include, I guess, efficiency is more about sort of the lighting inside, but weatherization is really about that envelope of a building and making it better for the environment.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. So a couple follow-up questions. One person pointed out that the wait list to get weatherization assistance can be extremely long, up to a year, and was wondering if there is enough funding behind the weatherization office. And a similar question, another person wondered about increasing the state's funding for the weatherization assistance program through progressive taxation. So interested to hear your thoughts about those two options.
Sure, I appreciate that. It has been underfunded for years and years and years, which is why, while we had a goal of 60,000 homes being weatherized, we've only done about 25,000, this was a goal set, 15 odd years ago. So this is a year-over-year compounding problem that really could have helped a lot of people with lowering their bills and making Vermont more affordable, which is one of the objectives of our administration. With respect to taxation, I touched on it earlier, but the question about progressive taxation, in my opinion, is spot on. For instance, we continue, really all of my adult life, even from my not quite adult life, when President Reagan got elected in 1980, I would say our tax policy has moved in a much more regressive direction. For those that don't know what regressive and progressive mean, a regressive tax is one that hits lower income and working class people harder, and a progressive tax is one that is more based on income. So no matter what your income is, it would take an equal percent. So if you had a 1% income tax, that's 1% no matter whether you make $40,000, $400,000, or $4 million, it would hit you proportionally the same. It would take 1%, and it would be more dollars from the bigger income earners. Things like sales taxes or fuel taxes, where you pay 20 cents on a gallon of fuel, well, that 20 cents is a much bigger hit on a working class person than the 20 cents is on someone who makes $200,000. And so that's a regressive tax, because as a percentage of your income, it's a much smaller number. So when I look at things like weatherization funds, I happen to think about this way on all tax policy, but we should be taxing in a more progressive way. And since Reagan was in office in the 1980s, the top tier income taxes, which were up at 70% back when he was in office, they've now been dropped down to the 20s and 32, 33% at the federal level. What that means is we don't have the funds at the federal level that have been distributed to the states over time for everything from education to all the different facets of government, health, human services, and environmental supports. And what that means then is that states have had to raise revenues to try to compensate for having less money. But the problem is, the argument is always made, if you raise taxes on the wealthy too much, they will move. They have more capacity to move from one state to another. And so most states raise regressive taxes because they're things that people have to pay, and they're things that most people don't have the ability to just up and move if their fuel taxes are a little higher than they can afford, or their sales taxes and so forth. So that's a long tax policy answer. But what I would say in most recent history, of course, is that Donald Trump, as president, pushed a massive high-income tax cut that, again, continued that policy that's been happening for 40 years since Reagan was in office, of lowering taxes on the wealthy, supposedly to boost the economy and help working people. But a lot of working people have been struggling for these last 40 years without really getting ahead. And that tax cut for Vermonters resulted in about $550 million, at least on paper, in savings each year. The top 5% of Vermonters are actually saving about half of that. $270 million is just going to the top 5% of the population. So I would argue, why don't we, during the duration of this tax cut, take half of that money, which would be about $100 to $110 million a year for these next 4 to 5 years, and use that to fund building affordable housing with energy efficiency and smaller units so that people's footprints are smaller, build those in those village centers to, again, reduce the energy footprint of travel and transportation. Maybe take $20 million a year towards affordable housing, $20 million a year towards investing in rural broadband. It's estimated that the state will need about $280 million of investment to get decent and high quality broadband throughout the state. But if we were to put $20 million a year for 4 or 5 years and leverage private dollars, we would very much get a long way towards that full $280 million. We could also, with about $20 million a year, invest in weatherization, as opposed to the $3 to $5 million a year that's going in right now. And the number of homes that could be weatherized to deal with that backlog and to help a lot more working families get their homes weatherized would be improved tremendously. Now, if we did that for 4 or 5 years, that would be a bit of an issue, because I was talking to weatherization companies earlier this year to understand how quickly we could ramp up and do all those homes. Because, of course, we need the workers to do it and the businesses to be able to operate to do it. And they said, if we knew we had a 3, 5, 7 year paying system, then we could ramp it up with 5 million, 10 million, and then 20 million and carry it on for a number of years at 20 million. A lot of homes could get done and they could build the workforce, because nobody wants to train a workforce for a 1 or 2 year financial return and investment that the state is doing. So people want to know that that's going to be a long-term investment that's going to keep going. And if we do it right, we could create a revolving loan fund from the payback to those funds as people save money, and we could do far more perpetual weatherization for the very old housing stock that we have in Vermont and here in New England. So yes, there is a backlog. We do need to fund it more. There is a source, but there isn't always the political will to go there.
Great. Thank you, Dave. So we have one more question about weatherization, and I know that this one is pretty relevant to a lot of the participants who are watching today as students and most of the time renters. So one person is wondering how you think we should address issues of when owners/landlords can afford to weatherize buildings, but have no incentive to because of shifting the cost of utilities onto renters who have limited options in the housing market. And would the state government allow towns and cities to pursue rent control as part of a climate strategy?
Well, that's a great series of questions. Well, I think there's a couple things. One is, if the state were to invest a lot more in affordable housing and more options for people for renting, then suddenly landlords would have to compete a lot more for those tenants. So particularly, this is an issue in Chittenden County. We may have viewers from across the state on this. But in Chittenden County and in Burlington, the rental situation and the vacancy rate is so small. 2 seconds, because that darn cat wants to come in. Hold on a second.
I was having the same problem with my roommate's cat earlier, so I was glad I was muted when you were speaking.
That's okay. So, it's a whole new world with these virtual meetings. We all get a little glimpse into everybody's homes and their lives. But so if we, in Chittenden County in particular, we need far more affordable housing. We need far more competition to make it so that landlords do have to actually compete for those tenants if we want to actually either bring down rents or have landlords pay for weatherizing their homes or their buildings. There's also people looking into creative ways to try and help landlords pay for the weatherization, because often landlords don't include heat in their rent. And if you're not including heat in the rent, then the landlord doesn't get the payback of the lower fuel bill. So either, there are some towns could consider forcing landlords to provide the heat, in which case clearly landlords would then look at what their net cost benefit analysis is. In Burlington, landlords are required to provide snow removal and trash removal. That's the only thing they're required to provide. They are required to have a heating system that can keep the house at 65 degrees, but that doesn't mean they actually have to keep it at 65 degrees, and they're not paying the fuel bill. So if the heat system can do that, but the tenants are paying huge prices because the heat's just going out through the windows and through the walls, that certainly isn't beneficial to the tenants. It's not beneficial to health and healthcare. We know that if homes are too cold and drafty, especially for a lot of low-income folks, that health ramifications occur. So we need to look at, I don't know that the state actually has to grant the authority for rent control. It may need to, but municipalities actually do their own ordinances. And even in a progressive city like Burlington, rent control has been a difficult piece of legislation to pass. That may or may not change. It all depends who your city councilors are and whether people participate in voting. I mention that because no matter what your views are, you could agree or disagree with anything that I'm saying, but on average, younger people vote in much, much lower numbers than older folks like me and folks that are yet older and into their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's a catch-22. A lot of times, people don't vote because they feel like the folks running for office aren't choices that they want, and so they don't vote. Well, then when they don't vote, the people that are running for office dismiss that population and pay attention to the issues of those people that do vote. And so it's this vicious cycle. And so I would argue it's important to even write somebody else in if you don't like the options, or consider meeting people and consider running for office, and or trying to talk someone else into running for office who represents the views you have. But if you participate in forums and you ask questions of candidates and ask them where they stand on these kinds of issues, then they will start to know that those issues matter. So maybe rent control matters, maybe weatherizing rental units matter. And unfortunately, a lot of landlords aren't doing the math that their property becomes more valuable if they weatherize their property. But that's still been a hurdle that some have done, most have not. And so those are great questions. I can't remember if I got all the sub parts of the question. If not, May Kate, you can remind me.
I think we covered everything. Thanks for making sure. Yeah, I'll try to feed you a little bit of a question at a time if that makes it easier.
It's all good.
Okay, so we have a slight counterpoint to some of the points you've been saying. So one viewer is asking, shouldn't we reduce taxes and cut back on regulation to make the cost of living cheaper, bring people closer to city centers, which reduces commutes and pollution, and put more money in people's pockets so that they can then afford to buy electric vehicles and perhaps solar panels on their roofs?
I do really appreciate that question because it's one that is talked about regularly. And if you actually look at the facts about Vermont, the reality that drives the costs of Vermont is not so much taxes. Yes, taxes are a very real budget item. They're a very real cost. But when you look at the price of housing, it is purely supply and demand. The cost of houses are not going to change drastically because taxes get lowered by 1% or so forth. And in fact, the ability to buy them isn't going to shift. Vermont has an advantage and a disadvantage with many rural parts of the country. The advantage and disadvantage is that we're very close to Boston, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and this incredibly dense and wealthy, not all wealthy, but a lot of people who have disposable income in those areas. And so the ability for someone to sell a property in Connecticut and buy in Vermont and get much more house and much more property for the same amount of money as they would get in Boston or Connecticut or New York is a big driver on why costs in Vermont are higher. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the sale of homes and people moving to Vermont is very much related to the price of housing in Massachusetts. And when it is above or below its past peak, and when people start feeling like they're in money-making territory by selling their homes in Massachusetts, they start to retire and come up and move to Vermont, and they buy properties that most Vermonters can't afford because of the incomes that folks in the Boston area have had. Another piece of the argument about lowering taxes will somehow create the economy that's magical, I would say look at Wisconsin, look at Kansas in particular. Kansas did huge tax cuts and said there would be a boom in business and a boom in the economy, and it would generate tax revenues for the state because there'd be so much more activity. And what they're finding is that boom never happened on the tax side, on the job side, and on the growth And so now Kansas is really facing huge hurdles at supporting their public schools, supporting their infrastructure, and so forth. So it's a bit of an economic myth that has not been proven at all positively that lowering taxes actually puts a whole lot of money in people's pockets. But the question is not across all taxes, because there are some taxes that I think are too high. Those regressive taxes that hit working people are too high. But when you lower taxes on really wealthy people, that extra money that they have doesn't tend to go into a second pool in the backyard or a third deck on the house or a fifth car or a second boat. It tends to go to Wall Street. So if you want to actually have people spend their money locally, the people that should have more money in their pockets are working class folks. And in Vermont, we've actually taken sales tax off of food and clothing items that are less luxurious. We have income sensitized our education taxes. So the bill that you get if you own your home looks really big, but then it gets adjusted downward by the state subsidizing some of that if your income is below about $130,000. So if you're making $40,000 or $50,000 a year, yours would be greatly reduced if you own your home. The real challenge right now is that the rental properties still have the higher taxes on them, and a lot of people who are low income are renters, and that those tax bills have to be incorporated in the rent. But I will say, to reveal something about myself, I do own a property in Burlington that I rent, and I've owned it for a very long time. I bought it actually as a student in 1994. And if your goal is to make huge amounts of income on your property, then your rents have to be really high. But actually, as a landlord, one can afford to charge reasonable rents, and property taxes are not the big driver of the bill as a landlord. The amount that property taxes go up, in the votes in Burlington, sometimes they go up maybe $100 or $150 or $200 a year, the property taxes, maybe even $500 a year. Well, $500 a year spread out over the whole year is only $50 of rent. And so it's important to recognize that even property taxes are not the significant driver in the most landlords' rents are based on supply and demand. The fact that rents are $1,000 a room without heat included is not because of the cost of property taxes. That's about the cost of the properties, which are quite high because Burlington is a desirable place to live. I will agree with the person who asked the question with respect to some aspect of regulations. I had introduced language probably 20 years ago now in the Natural Resources and Energy Committee to allow for fewer regulatory hurdles if one were to build more dense housing in village and town centers. At the time, I said if you're going to build more than 8 units per acre, which is still, everybody could have a little yard at that situation, or you could build a multi-unit building with a bigger yard and easily try to reduce some of the regulatory hurdles. At the time, 20 years ago, that was considered too dense, which for those of us who are from out of state, I grew up in the Boston area, 8 units per acre is not too dense. We're used to much more dense housing. I think today, something like that would have a much better chance of passing, to talk about if you're building in a designated village or town center or city, designated city, that you could lower the hurdles so long as you built density and provide a certain level of what's called inclusionary zoning, which is to keep the rents on some of the properties not at market rent, but at an affordable rent. Because when you rely on the free market, people are always going to build for that higher end property that's going to make them more money. And that's one of the reasons you don't end up with as much affordable housing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and ask some questions about energy production. But I do want to say that we have quite a few questions in the queue, and I want to shout out to my co-TAs, Joe and Chris, for doing such an amazing job organizing these and feeding me questions. But maybe just in the interest of time and addressing as many questions as we can.
Shorter answers.
Yeah, we can keep the answers a little more brief. So starting with kind of the energy production questions. The first question is, what can the state of Vermont do to increase renewable energy production, such as wind and solar power, to reduce our reliance on traditional fossil fuels?
Well, there's a couple different things. We used to incent putting on solar power with our greater net metering incentive. If you put solar power on, you got an energy value of 6 cents per kilowatt hour added to the value of the energy that you produced. That has dropped to 2 cents for newer production now. So certainly there's one thing we could do is turn that back around and go back up a little bit. We also, depending on revenues and how we tax people, could put more money into incentivizing folks with helping pay the upfront cost and giving either low interest or no interest loans so that folks could put solar power on their buildings or in their yards to incent that. With respect to wind energy, the state has really shifted its policy on wind and larger solar installations to make it easier for neighbors and towns to limit how much of that goes in their community. And so that's where more regulatory hurdles have been put in place, making it harder to build. So reviewing those hurdles, just as a side note, I happen to live in a house that was built next to the barn and incorporates 2 silos that were the silos of the barn. And silos, when they first went up, the tall, round silos next to barns, the communities were saying, those are ugly, they're an eyesore, they ruin the look of the barn. Well, now when you drive around Vermont, you look at silos, you think they're this bucolic, beautiful view from what the past used to be with these vertical round silos. I think solar and wind power, while right now people view them sometimes as visually obtrusive, for many others, it's viewed as hope for the future and an opportunity for our kids to have a planet they can live on. And that the land area that's being covered by them, and even the few hills that are being dotted with wind turbines, is a reasonable, quote, price to pay to have a planet that we can live on. So some of it is people's involvement in politics, voting, and having people in office that recognize the need for these things.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dave. So a follow-on question, related topic, is someone's wondering what the state of Vermont can do to prevent the federal government from spending billions to bail out the oil industry and instead put that money towards green energy solutions.
Well, I wish I could give you a really positive and optimistic answer. I think Vermont can make its own choices about what we do and incent and join with other states in incenting policies at the state level that lowers our use of fossil fuel or incents people to buy vehicles that use less fossil fuel. We can also look at our investment portfolios and think about whether Vermont ought to be invested in fossil fuels. Just yesterday, for the first time in history, oil prices around the world were in negative territory. People were actually paying folks to take oil off their hands because the supply versus demand curve is upside down. So oil companies are not making money right now. It's not the place to be invested in, and yet many state funds are still invested in them. So we have that opportunity, but that's a decision of the investment boards. The other thing is who is in our federal delegation. And right now we have 3 folks, 2 senators, Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders, as well as our Congressman Welsh, who are all very strongly interested in lowering the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry and putting more money towards renewable energy and other more productive climate future mitigation issues. That includes even war in the military-industrial complex. Many of our wars have been fought over natural resources, including, while cloaked in humanitarian issues, much of the Middle East is about oil and those petroleum reserves. And if we move ourselves away from being an oil-based economy, we would also save a lot of money on the military, which could be used in more productive ways.
Great. So one student is wondering, since a lot of the time when we talk about transitioning our energy systems, that we talk about really big structural solutions. So the question is, are there smaller community-oriented steps that we can take towards achieving the goals of more renewable energy production? Specifically, thinking about your audience here, who's a bunch of students.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I got distracted for half a second.
Oh, no worries. So I was just mentioning how when we talk about transitioning our energy system, we often talk about these big structural solutions, but one student is wondering what smaller community-oriented steps we can take towards achieving those same goals, and specifically, in terms of students here.
Well, I think there's a number of things you can do. When I was a student at UVM, my first year was the second year of a program called Vermont Student Environmental Program. It was a student club. I believe it's still in existence, actually. Very excited to have heard that recently. And this guy, John O'Niles, had instigated a recycling program across the whole campus. And he was almost a one-man show the year before we got there. There were just a couple folks. And then there were more of us that joined VSTEP and started literally going around campus a couple times a week, collecting the recycling from all the dorms and many of the bigger academic buildings. And eventually the school took over recycling programs, and UVM became much more of a green standard school, although I would argue maybe in some regards other schools have leapfrogged UVM. So you have an opportunity within the school, through your student government and through student activism, to continue to push the school to implement greener policies on campus. It might be about disposable cups and plates and bowls and things like that, and the energy that goes into disposable, plasticware and all of that. Actually, to tell a funny story, when I left to hike the Appalachian Trail and finished school after a year and a half, there was no shuttle bus system on campus. And when I returned, there was this broadly implemented shuttle bus system on campus. And I thought, why are we driving buses across the campus when many folks attend UVM because it's in such an outdoors state? People like to ride bikes, go skiing, go down to the lake, go swimming. And yet we need this bus system to get to classes. Now, I'm sure this is not going to be very popular with some of the students, but do you really need a bus system to get you across campus when you already should be incentivized to get to class by the price tag of going to UVM? It's why are people at universities? I think that's a lot of what I questioned in myself after my first year and a half, when I was more engaged as an activist, when I was more engaged with extracurricular activities. Some of them were maybe not as appropriate as they could have been than my academics in those first year and a half. And that's a lot of fun, but is it really worth the cost of going to college to do that or not? And the reason I bring that in is that a lot of folks the next day, when you wake up, you don't really want to have to deal with the energy of getting across campus. Well, thankfully, some of those buses, I think, have gone to compressed natural gas, and some are even maybe electric at this point. But what could the university be doing more and more around transportation on campus to make it an even greener campus? And then ultimately, we all have to make our own decisions of how warm. I mean, if you're in the dorms, that's one thing. But if you're renting an apartment and you're paying heat, what's the temperature of the heat in your house? I often in my own home, and right now I'm wearing under my shirt a warm shirt underneath to be able to keep heat lowered. There are individual choices we can all make in terms of what temperature we heat our house, how often do we walk where we need to go, or bike if we're physically able, as opposed to driving. What food do we buy? Where do we put our dollars? As individuals, you have a lot of choice in what you buy. And the more sort of processed food you buy, typically there's more energy and or energy subsidy in those foods than buying raw ingredients and cooking. In fact, not only that, when you cook your food and with raw ingredients, you often get much better flavor and possibly better nutrition. So there's a whole lot of things around how you spend your dollars on a day-to-day basis. Some people give me grief for having long hair and being a politician. Well, guess what? I've probably saved $5,000 in the last 20 years not getting haircuts. So you never know. There's all kinds of choices we make. How often do you replace your cell phone? How often do you get a new pair of sneakers or shoes? Choosing where you spend those disposable dollars is going to be the one thing that gives the biggest impact on the planet, I think, as an individual, as each student, as each person.
Great. Kind of tacking on to that point you made at the end about the power of your spending. One student is wondering what you think people who are struggling with money and poverty can do to tackle climate change.
I think that's a much bigger hurdle because for those that have disposable income, you have more choice in where to spend it. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, I think it's a much harder situation. And I know a number of people who almost feel shame in that they're not able to do what they want to do, what they know is the right thing to do. And I think it's really important that we don't create a society that shames people for making the wrong decision, because not everybody has the means to make the right decision either all the time or some of the time. So I think some of the things that working class struggling Vermonters could do, whether you're a student or not, is think about who you're voting into office, who's making these decisions. Ultimately, a lot of people are struggling, I would argue, because the minimum wage is so low. Folks are struggling because they have health insurance bills that are too high. So I think tying these different issues together to who's in office and who's making the societal policy is really going to be what impacts working class people, for them to be able to have a situation where they can make the decisions that are within their means to do more for the climate. I mean, the reality is, if you're having a hard time putting food on the table, you're not going to buy the more expensive recycled toilet paper that saves trees and reduces energy and water use and so forth. If you're having trouble putting food on the table, you're not going to check off the box on your electric bill that says, I'm willing to pay an extra 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour in order to buy greener energy. I think it's a very real struggle for a lot of people. And I guess in the small things people can do is think about how often you drive, where you're going. But again, if you have to work 60 hours a week to make enough money to pay your bills, maybe you feel you have to drive because the time it takes to travel that distance is an important amount of time, because if you're working 60 hours a week, you just don't have time between jobs or between home and work that you do if you're working 30 hours a week and you can walk or bike the 1/2 mile or a mile to work. So I think it's really important as community members to make sure people are not shamed for the decisions they make when the decisions they make are driven by their economic reality.
Thank you so much for that answer. So we're going to move and ask a couple questions about the food system now, which I know that you're excited to answer. So the first question is, do you recommend that Vermont try to be more self-sufficient for its food supply as a way to address the issues around emissions related with transporting food products?
Well, absolutely. I may have mentioned earlier, I've actually been up since about 6, and I don't remember everything I've said in this conversation because it's the end of the day and it's been a very busy day. But I may have mentioned earlier that the average food in this country, at least a number of years ago, travels between 12 and 1,500 miles to get to the plate. And Vermont has done a number of policies. We passed a bill called Farm to Plate to try to really study and analyze the Vermont food system and how much food is grown in Vermont, what parts of the system could be supported to produce more in Vermont and be sold locally to restaurants and stores. And you can look up on Google Farm to Plate Vermont, and there are reports over many years about the growth in local food production. We passed a bill a few years ago called the Working Lands Bill, which now I believe has almost $1 million a year of incentives to help farms become more efficient or grow so that we can have more food produced in Vermont. Sometimes scale can be more efficient, but also sometimes scale can be more damaging. So we have to make sure we also grow our scales of production in a way that is sustainable for the planet and the workers and the farms themselves. Some tools make farming more efficient. That picture earlier of me on that cultivating tractor made it so that we could grow 10 and 15 acres of vegetables with 10 people on the farm. But if we were hoeing those 15 acres, it would take a lot more people. And so there's trade-offs of using fossil fuel and the cost of food. I know some farms have had the wherewithal, which I do not, to convert some of those tractors to solar power. And that's something I'd like to look into. unfortunately, serving in public office takes a lot of hours and has removed my time that I would do in the winter researching and investing in how to convert those tractors. But there's a number of things that the state could be doing in an inventive and ingenious way to grow more food locally, have a greater supply. I think one of the big issues right now is also food storage. Our farm has 3 rooms that are, I don't know, between 10, probably 15 to 20 feet wide by 15 to 25 feet long that we store food in. And like I said, we only have enough food for all of Chittenden County for one day, less than a pound of food. So Vermont could also build larger food warehouses for storage and help incent cooperatives in terms of production of a lot of the basic supplies that we need. Because farmers are being creative. There's more people growing flour. There's more people growing basic needs foods. But we don't always have the storage capacity for it.
Thanks, Dave. You actually answered a question that was in the queue as part of your answer to that question. So you're being very efficient. I appreciate it. Just like our energy systems need to be.
Trying to read your mind.
Yeah, exactly. So we are coming into the final minutes. So we're going to potentially end. We'll see what we can get through. With some questions related to climate and the current virus crisis that we're all facing. Mm-hmm. So one person is wondering if you have any plans for a resilience plan for Burlington residents after the stay-at-home orders are released.
Current plans, sorry, repeat that?
Do you have any plans for a resilience plan for Burlington residents after the stay-at-home orders are released? Specifically like climate resilience.
Sure. Burlington itself, so my job as lieutenant governor is not to direct individual municipal policy. So I don't have specific plans for Burlington. My understanding is that the mayor and the city council of Burlington have passed a number of ideas lately. I don't know if they're all ordinances or plans and resources and investments for really greening the city of Burlington. I know the head of the Transportation Public Works Office, and he actually founded Bikes, I can't remember the name of it anymore, but Local Motion, which was about more bicycle opportunities. The city has implemented far more bike lanes, although it's got a long ways to go. And so in the transportation arena, there's a lot of interest in, again, expanding opportunities of public transportation. The downtown central hub was built to try to facilitate more efficient public transportation. But I believe the city has really started moving in a direction trying to do more. I don't have a lot of details on that one, and I apologize to whoever asked the question. But they could reach out to their city councilor, and I'm sure that person would be able to answer that better than I do.
That's a great suggestion. So I know that a lot of people have brought up budget concerns that may be coming to light with the response to this virus and the funds being redirected. So one person is wondering if the current crisis is putting any major climate policies or bills on hold here in Vermont.
Oh, absolutely. Legislators right now are working around the clock to address, at least for this last month in particular, policy shifts that were needed to address the coronavirus epidemic. So some of that was regulations, some of that was trying to make sure supplies were available, personal protective equipment for nurses, regulations to allow folks that were in medicine in the last 3 years to come back into medicine in case we needed more nurses or doctors, all kinds of issues around landlords and tenants and unemployment insurance. And so really the focus has been about economic stability for Vermonters and health for Vermonters during this pandemic. This is the time that would have been spent on issues like the Global Warming Solutions Act and other bills around setting standards and making investments in a climate solution way for our future. I do know that legislators and those committees are starting to evaluate some of the bills that were rapidly placed on hold, and there's still some opportunity, but I would say the coronavirus pandemic has really set us back on these other conversations. even though the coronavirus has actually revealed all the more reasons that they're important to move forward with. I don't know that the legislature will be done in mid-May as it normally is, because there's been such a pause, and we still have to do the budget, and that is thrown for a loop based on changed revenues for the state, changed needs and demands on the state, the federal money that just came in. So odds are less will pass this year than we had hoped because of the coronavirus.
That's unfortunate, but definitely needed in this time.
Very unfortunate.
So this is going to be our last question. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions in this Q&A. The other questions that could be asked could be good things for you to reflect on in your optional extra credit assignment about this talk, or you could post them to the climate change discussion board that we have for our class, and you could maybe discuss those with some fellow students. So for our final question, a student is wondering, what ways are you targeting young people to make change related to climate?
Well, I have always welcomed the Youth Climate Caucus and the Youth Initiative, excuse me, that are involved. Particularly, there's a lot of high school and even 7th and 8th graders who have been getting involved in that all across the state. There's often a youth lobby day. I've always welcomed and spoken to youth that come year-round to the State House when I'm there, and have really tried to reach out to young people through various groups, including Youth Lobby. The Governor's Institute is an organization that I know Professor Paul Bierman is involved with, that has worked on everything from arts to science to all kinds of different, creative writing and otherwise. But I've often spoken with some of those high school folks about climate issues and environmental issues, including agriculture, transportation, and energy. And then at the university, I do try to get up to any class that anybody wants to sort of have me in to talk about how policies are made, how we can make steps towards a greener economy and a greener opportunity for the future for young people. I'll wrap some of this by saying that, a lot of my passion for the environment has come from my own upbringing as a young person who grew up both in the Boston area and in rural Virginia. And then coming to UVM just really sort of opened the door for the thoughts in my head of what was possible. But as I've now gotten older, my daughter, I just get more and more concerned about the future. As a farmer living with the consequences of much more powerful windstorms, today was quite frightening with respect to our high tunnels and the infrastructure on the farm, greater power outages, much more severe rains and powerful storms. These are all going to have impact that we feel daily as farmers, and you will feel seasonally with food production or energy issues as these storms come through in the spring and fall, in particular as the seasons change. And so thinking about my daughter and her future, thinking about a young woman I met at the farmer's market in January who at 17 said, most of my friends are talking about just maybe not just delaying having kids, but not having kids. We've actually got to work towards a climate and a future that really gives people an opportunity to live with hope and opportunity. And I'm happy to talk with and work with any young people about how to build that, both locally in your communities, as well as politically at the state and national level. So people can reach out to my office anytime.
All right. Well, I just want to give a big thanks first to Dave for spending an evening with us like this. We really wanted to have you in class, but this is the next best thing, and in fact, some ways better, because I'm sure people saw this who wouldn't have seen it in class. And then another big thanks to Joe and May Kate and Chris for all that background work to get the questions sorted and make everything go smoothly. So I hope everybody has a great night. Again, big thanks, Dave, for spending time with us.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, May Kate. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. All right, we are no longer live, which means it's just us again.
Thanks for the cue on shortening my answers. Sorry about that, May Kate.
No, it's okay. I can tell you're really passionate about everything.
Yeah, so I thought that went really well.